an enthusiastic lifeboater, and to be honest, I've probably been a fairly enthusiastic lifeboater for much of the rest of my life, as will become obvious as I talk. After Atlantic College in Oxford, I went to train as an accountant and had a reasonably conventional career up to the point of becoming finance director of an international group listed on the UK Stock Exchange, apart from a couple of years out when I managed Elton John's affairs, which was a slightly interesting and slightly different thing for a young accountant to do. The company I was finance director of was taken over, and I was looking for something interesting to do after that. And a colleague of mine, a banker, knew about a company one of his colleagues was handling that was in distress, a firm of consulting engineers that had borrowed rather a lot of money from the bank and wasn't paying it back. And they wanted to appoint somebody onto their board to actually help them sort that situation out. Well, I was appointed. That was my first experience of what is called corporate turnaround or company doctoring. And I ended up selling that business in what would now be called a pre-pack. The term hadn't been invented at that time, but essentially an insolvent disposal to preserve the going concern business. The bank were very pleased. They asked me to do a number of things during the 60s, and that led through one or two ups and downs to the Royal Opera House, which I went in initially to advise in 1998, and then became the chief executive there for a period of time and did the financial restructuring, which I'll talk a little bit about in a moment. After that, I started to get very much involved with hospitals. And for the last 15 years, my professional work has been almost entirely around failing hospitals within the National Health System in the UK, although I have done a little bit of work in America and some work in the Middle East. So I have a slightly broader vision of some of the issues that arise. So what I'm going to do today is talk about generically what happens with public organisations, and then specifically talk through some of the interesting issues on the two cases, the Royal Opera House and University College London hospitals. If I can share a screen with you, I hope that has now come up. You should have a heading that says, why do public organisations fail and can they be rescued? Firstly, just to clarify what I mean by a public organisation. It's an organisation that provides services in some way. It may be owned by the government, it may be owned by a charity or some other non-governmental organisation, something along those lines. But essentially it is funded to provide services. Transport, healthcare, police services, defence, performing arts, and also, relevantly perhaps in this context, I would describe Atlantic College as a public organisation, hopefully not one that's failing. And a failure of a public organisation doesn't usually involve insolvency, because essentially it collapses, it doesn't go bust. There's generally somebody behind it who would have to pick up the bills, and it is working out who that person is and what their response is to the situation that is particularly interesting. But when a public organisation does fail, firstly, the service that it provides ceases to be available. And that, of course, can matter a huge deal. Would some people say it doesn't matter too much if we lose an opera house, but most people were pretty concerned if we lost a hospital and if it was the hospital that they depended upon. Also, of course, in the context of failure, there will always be extra costs for somebody, partly to cover the gap that's left, partly to cover the mess that results, redundancy costs and so on. There will have to be emergency actions that have unhappy consequences that are generally best avoided. And finally, and perhaps quite importantly in terms of controlling the way this all rolls out, there is great personal embarrassment for the people involved. Because if you are in charge of a failing organisation, you tend to come in for a lot of very critical public scrutiny. Now, to avoid a failure, a public organisation needs to do some fairly simple things. And frankly, they are all blindingly obvious. The sad thing is that many public organisations simply don't do them. The first thing is to have a clear idea of what it is trying to do. Now, that may be obvious. If you're a hospital, you want to be a hospital. But do you want to be a specialist hospital, or do you want to focus on older people, or do you want to be particularly good at emergency care? What exactly do you want to do? And is what you're trying to do agreed with all of the parties who are involved? So the management, the staff, the local public, the people who pay the bills. Does everybody agree what that organization is trying to do? Again, you would think that would always be the case, but I assure you it is not. And linked to that, is there sufficient funding to do what everybody expects it to do? There's no point in having an organization that's going to cost $100 million to run if you've only got $20 million to do it with. You clearly cannot meet expectations in those circumstances. So you need a clear vision and you need adequate funding to cope with it. You then need a team of people who are working together, and I emphasize the working together. In all my time in hospitals, I've only ever come across one hospital that had a management team that was substantive, complete, and working together. And I've seen an awful lot of hospitals. You do need to have good leadership, and leadership is something that people talk about in rather loose terms. But it is very obvious when you go to an organization that is well led, how that differs from an organization that is weakly or poorly led. And that organization, if it's of any size and complexity, needs to have an appropriate organization structure. And you'll get a good example of what I mean by that when we talk about UCLH. And of course, you need good management information. You need to know how much money is coming in, how much money is going out, what's being done, and so on. And the final third element is that that team of people have to have a plan. And again, I don't necessarily mean a 500-page McKinsey special that goes into enormous detail and analyzes absolutely everything in sight. But broadly speaking, the way the job is being done needs to be set out and agreed. And there's this lovely quote, which I gather is ascribed to Benjamin Franklin, but isn't actually his, that if you fail to plan, you are planning to fail. Certainly very true in anything remotely resembling a complex organization. Now, that's what we're going to talk about. I'm going to bring this back on the screen at the end because I'm just going to talk through the two organizations that I'll discuss, the Royal Opera House and University College London Hospitals, which part of those checklist, if you like, they failed on. And in a sense, you'll get the impression of how we fix that. So coming back, you can, behind me, see a glorious picture of Atlantic College. We will now move on from that, if we can find the right bit, to a picture of the Royal Opera House. Right, why doesn't that work? Oh, you have the Royal Opera House, that's right. Yes, excellent. The Royal Opera House, that's the auditorium, seats 2,412 people, give or take one. It's one of the 5 great opera houses in the world. It's been around for a very long time. Traditionally, opera houses, when they run into difficulty, get burnt down. That's not considered the modern way of dealing with such problems. But the Royal Opera House in Covent Garden in London had a plan to redevelop since the mid-50s for quite a long period of time and just hadn't managed to get the money it needed to do it. It's home to the Royal Opera, the Royal Ballet, and the Royal Opera House Orchestra. It employs about 1,000 people. Now, what happened during the 90s was that we had this wonderful thing called the National Lottery, which is a scheme that is very elegantly designed to rob the poor and give the money to the rich. It essentially takes money from people who gamble and devotes it to causes that the trustees of the lottery believe are worthwhile. And their first major grant was to the Royal Opera House, about 50-odd million pounds. And that was sufficient for the then leadership of the Opera House to say, right, we can finally embark on this massive redevelopment that we've wanted to do. 200 million pounds altogether. We'll get about 1/3 of it from the National Lottery. We'll get about 1/3 of it from donors, a fundraising appeal, and the other 1/3 will come from selling long leases in the retail property around the outside of the new building. All very good stuff. And in capital terms and in building terms, planned very well. Now, the Opera House is important. It's the most expensively funded arts organisation in the United Kingdom, and it has quite a high profile in terms of London and the status of London. The old Opera House that they were trying to refurbish had poor backstage facilities. It wasn't attractive to the top quality people, tatty front of house, poor catering, no longer essentially world class. And at that time, it didn't really have very much in the way of political support, and they were waiting for this opportunity. Anyway, once they'd seized that opportunity, got the money committed, launched the plan, announced that they were going to close the Royal Opera House, a couple of things happened. Firstly, the management team who had initiated all of that got fired and were replaced by new people who had rather different plans and thoughts. Also, they started to realize that although great plans had been made for the capital cost of the work, perfectly adequately in fact, nobody had really made any sensible plans for what the Opera House would look like financially after it was reopened. And that was because they assumed that if everything was new and straightforward, it would be easier and less expensive to run. But it was 3 times the size. So frankly, that was a rather naive assumption to have at that plan. Anyway, they closed, the redevelopment work started. Now, one of the funny things about performing arts organizations is that you get an awful lot of money in advance from your customers that actually converts to income when you take the curtain up on the first performance. So the cash flow of performing arts organizations that are high profile and successful is generally quite good. But of course, when the Opera House shut, that stopped. They no longer had the benefit of the cash flow that came in advance from performances. And so they went bust, and they went bust twice, once in early 1997 and the second in November 1997. They were bailed out in the first time by the government through the Arts Council. The second time, the Arts Council wasn't prepared to bail them out, and part of the funding that was to be used for the capital cost of the building was deployed to pay the payroll and keep the Opera House alive. But a condition of that was that they appointed somebody to help them to stop that happening again. And I was that somebody. So I went in initially as an advisor to work with the incumbent chief executive, but she, 3 months later, decided that she had to leave, and I took over as the chief executive. Now, the first thing to do in a situation like that is to make sure you do understand the numbers. The problem was they didn't have any. Their year end had been the previous 31st of March. That was 10 months earlier. They had no up-to-date financial information since that point. They didn't even know how much money was in the bank, other than the fact that there wasn't any. There was no backup to that. They'd appointed a new chairman, and there was a general sense of chaos and confusion. That I was able to get to grips with by a number of decisions that at the time were considered brave, but with hindsight were just considered sensible, some external consulting support, but essentially to get a clear picture of where the Royal Opera House was then, and more importantly, where it would be as the months rolled out to the time at which it was actually going to open. And they indicated quite clearly that there would not be enough money to run the Opera House when it reopened. There'd be enough money to complete the building, but we wouldn't be able to operate it. Now, one of the tenets of insolvency is that you go bust when you know you're going to go bust, not when you actually run out of cash. So at that time, we knew we couldn't afford to run the Opera House, and therefore we were going to go bust, and therefore we had to do something about it. So we did all the work around what our options were, where money could come from, could costs be saved, all that normal sort of stuff. And the conclusion was quite simple, that if you want to run a world-class opera house, it costs you a lot of money. In fact, at that time, it cost about £100,000 every time you lifted the curtain in the Royal Opera House. And that money has to come partly from the box office and partly from other sources. And there wasn't enough money coming from the other sources. We wrote to the government and explained this to them because they, behind the Arts Council, were essentially the people who were the funders of last resort for the Royal Opera House. We had several months of debate and discussion during which they declined to take responsibility, culminating in a meeting with the Secretary of State in September 1998, where we basically explained the situation finally face to face. And as is usual with government ministers, didn't get a straight answer. There was no preparedness to know exactly what, to give us the answer. So we went back, I went back with the chairman to his office, and we agreed we hadn't got an answer, we hadn't got the money we needed. So I phoned the Department of Culture, Media and Sport up, said, thank you very much for the meeting, but since we don't have the money, we're going to close the Opera House. That was on a Monday. They rang back 2 hours later to say, you must have misunderstood. Of course, there will be money, but it will have strings attached. We had a meeting with the staff on the Wednesday. The meeting called to close the Opera House and said it would actually only be closing temporarily. The money came, the place was finished. It was only an extra £5 million a year, not a very considerable amount in context. And the Opera House then did go on to open on time. The capital was completed, the building was completed. And for any of you who are interested in these things, it turned out to be absolutely fabulous. And for 10 years at least, from about 2002, was the leading opera house in the world in terms of the standard of both the artistic work and the facilities that it enjoyed. But at that time, quite a nerve-wracking and quite a tense problem that could only effectively be resolved by giving the government an ultimatum, which I'm very glad to say they accepted and responded in the appropriate way to do. That was my introduction to public sector turnaround. Hospitals are slightly different. And the hospital I'm about to talk to now is University College London Hospitals, and I think I can probably find a picture of that for you, just to put behind me as we're talking. Yes. A big, beautiful, modern building in the north of central London that was effectively bringing together two hospitals, two former old hospitals that had run out of steam. University College London Hospital, it's one of the big London teaching hospitals, arguably one of only two world-class hospitals in the UK. Broad range of services, at that time a turnover of about £500 million, 6,000 staff, major research centre, and it was the aggregation over time of 8 distinct and separate hospitals. But rather interestingly and rather critically, it was run through a single income statement. Now, most of you, I hope, are not accountants, but anybody who is an accountant will mean that actually there was only one column of figures. So there was no way in which you could look at the profitability or the contribution of any part of the business. You could only look at it as a single entity, which makes it impossible to delegate responsibility in any meaningful sense and very, very difficult to run. Anyway, they had the plan to merge 2 old hospitals into the new one that you can see behind me. And it was a very good plan, and it was very well done, and it was very well executed, and the move itself went extremely well by the standards of these type of things, extremely well. The only complication, which nobody understood at the time, was when all the planning was done, the hospital was funded by the government, by the National Health Service, on the basis of a block grant. It received so many £1 million each month to pay its bills. But the government, in a moment of madness, changed the way in which hospitals were funded to something called payment by results, under which hospitals would actually be paid for each operation, each consulting appointment and so on that they had. And the transition, as luck would have it, from the block funding moment to the payment by results moment happened at just the same time that UCLH moved into its new building. Now, when you move a large complex organization into new premises, you lose some production. If you do it well, you don't lose very much. UCLH lost 2 weeks production on average over a period of about 6 to 8 weeks. So essentially they managed to reduce the amount of missed work to just a couple of weeks, despite moving 6,000 people from 2 hospitals to a new base and all that involved. A remarkable organizational achievement. And under normal circumstances, if that had been planned for, there would have been no problem. But it wasn't planned for. 2 weeks production is 4% of annual turnover of about 500 million, 4% of that is 20 million, suddenly they hadn't got, and they weren't expecting not to have it. So as this started to emerge during the course of that summer, they increasingly worried. And they became a matter of concern not only for the board of the hospital, but also for the regulator. And at this stage, this was a very embarrassing situation. This was a new hospital, very close to the centre of London. It's the place where the Queen gets treated. It's the place where the Prime Minister gets treated. They'd made a great song and dance about opening this hospital, and suddenly it didn't have enough money. So they did what people do in these circumstances, appoint consultants. They appointed KPMG who came along and said, no, it isn't a £20 million hole, it's a £30 million hole. And surprise, surprise, we can give you a plan to fix it. So they gave a plan, and part of that plan was that the hospital had to appoint a turnaround director to actually help the management team deal with the problem that they were facing. And I was that turnaround director. Now, they had a very strong management team. It's a well-run hospital in clinical terms, but they weren't pulling in the same direction, and they didn't really quite know how to manage it. It was impossible to delegate management authority in any proper way. There were major structural issues about responsibility. It was very unclear where responsibility for management decisions and financial decisions lay. Huge overdependence on external consultants. They didn't actually have serious finance people internally. And although they had a financial recovery plan that KPMG had written for them that would have worked in the short term, it didn't address the longer term structural problems of the fact that it wasn't organized in the right sort of way. Now, I realized that in order to fix this problem, it wasn't just a question of fixing the very short term, but I had to leave them with something that would work in the longer term. And to do that, I had to change the way it was organized. So I worked with two of the medical directors and the finance director, and we came up with a restructuring of the hospital, separating it into divisions, each a division having separate units, a proper distinct organization structure, clinically led, so that we had doctors making and indeed other health professionals making the major decisions, but with good management information and a good structure. And there was a consensus amongst us that that would work and would enable this thing to be properly run and properly managed. The chief executive didn't like this idea for fairly obvious reasons, because we were effectively telling him how to run his business. And it all came to a head in a board meeting at which we were asked to discuss the situation. I explained as the turnaround director what I wanted to do. The chairman asked the chief executive what he thought about it. The chief executive said, I broadly agree with Pelham, but I don't think this is urgent. I think we should do it over a period of years. Chairman said, that sounds fine. It's clearly consensus. I'll leave it to you to sort out. And I said, excuse me, Chairman, we actually have a fundamental difference about how we're going to do this and when we're going to do this. I really think we've got to get on with this now. One of the non-executives perked up and said, well, we've hired this turnaround director to tell us what to do. He's telling us we should do this now. Then clearly we should take his advice. The other non-executives agreed, and the mood of the meeting was that we should get on with this restructuring, to the considerable and rather red-faced embarrassment of the chief executive, who left the meeting, took a week's holiday, and came back and said, I've changed my mind. We will get on with this. And by doing so, he effectively retook leadership of his own organization, did a very, very good job with relatively little external help, and got a knighthood, which unfortunately I wasn't given for doing this job, but such is the way these things work. But the point there was all about making sure that we had a viable and workable way of running a complex business. Because once you've got a strong management team and you've got a plan and it's well organized, then the business actually can do a good job. And that hospital has gone subsequently from strength to strength and is considered to be one of the most successful hospitals in the UK. So 2 examples there. Now I'd like to go back, if we may, to the screen that we had. To avoid failure, a public organisation needs a clear vision of what the organisation is trying to do and adequate funding to deliver. Well, the problem that we had at UCLH was that there was not an agreement by all the parties. There was not agreement at board level, not agreement between the executives and the non-executives about what they were really trying to do. So we had an issue at that stage. Funding to deliver, well, the Royal Opera House didn't have funding to deliver. The Royal Opera House didn't have a team of people working together. It certainly didn't have good leadership. UCLH didn't have a good organisation structure. Management information was poor at both the Royal Opera House and UCLH, and neither the Opera House nor UCLH had an adequate plan to deal with the situation they found themselves in. So just running through that checklist with either of those 2 organisations in a reasonably honest and straightforward way would have indicated that they had fundamental problems that needed to be addressed. And once addressed, could actually lead to very satisfactory outcomes for both of us. So at breakneck speed, that's both the principle, illuminated, I hope, by a couple of examples. Very happy now to take questions and comments and open this up into a more general discussion. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Pelham. I think sort of the first question is from Philip Green. I'll just unmute him now and then he can ask his question. One sec. Philip, are you there? Yeah.
Hi, Pelham. Nice to see you again.
Philip, good afternoon.
Very interesting, and I like your bullet point summary, easy to digest. It's my observation that public organizations nearly always say they don't have adequate funding, and certainly here in Canada, the CBC is always saying this or that organization doesn't have adequate funding and there's a need for more. I don't think I've ever heard a public organization saying, no, we have just the right amount of funding, we're just fine, thank you very much, please don't send us any more. I've never heard that. So I don't know whether that's something inherent in public organizations or whether that's because there's something on your checklist here, and it seems to me mission creep and not agreeing on what they're supposed to do is fundamentally the cause. They always want to seem to do more, and so they always need more money.
There is an element of that, and that would go back to different interpretations. I think you've got to mute again now. Otherwise, it's going to feedback. Yeah, that comes down to different interpretations of what you're trying to do. Because when you talk about mission creep, that suggests that the organization is actually taking what it is trying to do beyond the expectations and requirements of the people who fund it. Now, clearly, at the margin, every organization thinks it hasn't got enough money. That's just a common state of life. You can and have to look carefully at how money is being spent. Is it being spent in a properly controlled and managed way, and so on? If you do that, and you've investigated with some degree of thoroughness what that organization is trying to do, how it's spending its money, and there still isn't enough money, then you have the problem. And it's not generally a problem at the margin. It's generally it's an order of magnitude problem. And the causing of that may well be mission creep, as you describe, but there are other reasons why organizations get into serious trouble. One of the problems we have typically in the UK is that the government effectively puts regulations and in particular expectations of salary increases and so on organizations that doesn't fund them. So the government, if you like, has an expectation of continuing incremental performance improvement, productivity gains, if you like, year by year. And the government will expect the organizations it funds to cumulatively achieve a 3 or 4% per annum compound productivity improvement. Well, if your business is providing people, that's very, very difficult to do, particularly if it's compounded by the fact that you have to pay your people more money because the government tells you to. So yes, in a sense, the substance in your point, every publicly funded organization says it wants more money, but you can look hard at how that money is being spent and look at the reasons why it isn't enough. Keith. Can't hear you.
Apologies. Hi, sorry, I was muted. Sally, are you there?
Sally? Is that Sally Horrocks?
Okay.
Yes.
Am I unmuted now?
Yes, you are.
You're muted.
Yeah, okay. You can't unmute yourself, I've just discovered. Yeah, I just wondered, very interesting, thank you very much. I mean, I would make the observation that one of the problems of public sector organisations in Britain in recent years is that government has been unwilling to give them enough money to do the job they're expecting to do. And I say this as a friend of two people who've been finance directors of NHS trusts and been sent on gardening leave because they've been trying to do an impossible job. But my more specific question is about the situation British universities are facing at the moment, because I'm sure the whole COVID-19 situation has created a huge problem for their income streams, and the government, having told universities to behave like businesses, is now telling them they're not businesses for the purposes of receiving support. at the moment. And I just wondered if you could, if you were called in by a university now to help it sort itself out, what sort of things would you be perhaps suggesting that they needed to be doing?
Well, I haven't been called in by universities, but I have been called in by the Church of England, which is in a not entirely dissimilar situation. The point is to distinguish between the short term and the longer term. There's a short term issue about not actually running out of cash this week, next week, or in the next month or two. And that has to be dealt with because it's in nobody's interest for an organization literally to just run out of money. And there you have to look at who's got the money and who suffers the most embarrassment if the organization fails in the short term. What the universities are doing, I think, but it's not my area, and correct me if I'm wrong, is they're actually effectively taking the money from people who thought they were going to be given courses, but are not now getting them in any real way. So it's kind of hanging on to its customers' money to maintain its short-term cash position. Because in all conscience, arguably, universities, a bit like travel companies, ought to have given back all the money they've received in advance when they're no longer providing tuition, but they're not doing that. But having sorted out in the short term what you do to stop the business running out of money this week, next week, you've got to look at what the plan for that organization is going to be in the medium to long term. Now, I think that the challenge that universities are going to face is that we're going to see far fewer people traveling internationally to study. So the large numbers of very, very highly charged, in both senses, Chinese students we've had in the UK simply aren't going to come in those numbers. We're going to find even people within the UK are perhaps being reluctant to travel to universities away from home. We're finding that people are getting more used to the idea of online learning, particularly if it is significantly cheaper than it was before. And to a certain extent, this is all a gap in the routine progress of the year-on-year educational timetable, which is probably never going to get quite recovered. So the challenge for the universities is to do two things. Firstly, to avoid running out of money today, tomorrow, and next month. And secondly, to sit down with a cold towel and work out what on earth the future holds, and to put together a sensible plan for that almost certainly will be very, very different from anything they've ever done before. There will then be transition costs, and they've got to demonstrate that the plan they've got in the longer term is viable, and they will have to take those plans back to government. That's kind of the only way it'll work. That's an off the head, top of the head response to a sector I'm not comfortable with. So anybody who knows anything about universities probably says this chap doesn't really know what he's talking about, which is broadly true. But I do know quite a lot about how to deal with failing organizations.
Brilliant, thank you. The next question actually comes from Andrea. Let me just unmute her 1 sec.
Hi, Andrea.
Hello, Pelham. Thank you very much for this very interesting talk. I'm very interested to know what was the role of philanthropy on the turnaround of the Royal Opera House, and if in the case of the UCL Hospital also it played a role, and if you could expand on that.
There was no material role for philanthropy at UCLH. They have their own charity, but which does important things, but on, frankly, a scale that's trivial by the comparison of the budget of the hospital as a whole. Philanthropy at the Royal Opera House was very important. The Opera House is supported by a number of trusts, particularly the large trusts that, in fact, Atlantic colleges also benefit from to a certain extent, Wolfson, that type of thing, but particularly the Sainsbury Trust, the Claw Trusts, and other trusts have set up by people who've been successful, particularly as it happens in the retail business. Those organizations have supported the Opera House and indeed the other major charitable and arts organizations in the UK. The same names crop up the whole time. When they were doing the fundraising for the Opera House, they tapped all of those normal subjects and got them enthusiastic and consulted them and made them feel engaged and all the right sort of things. And when they had the public fundraising, they did what you do in these situations, which have something like 60% of the money they intended to raise spoken for before you even went public. so people felt that they were joining a successful fundraising philanthropy campaign. The bit that it became interesting is that the government money that we had to run the house when it opened essentially provided us with enough cash to open the house for 200 nights a year, whereas previously we had expected to open it for 300 nights a year. And there's some interesting stuff about what's proportional to the number of events and what's not. But essentially, the expression was 2/3 of the art for 2/3 of the money. So we said we needed 30 million to run it. The government said, well, you can only have 20 million. So we said, well, you can only have 200 performances then. And the government said, fine, 200 performances is enough if they're done to world-class standards. But we had a little bit of interesting fun and games with the private donors, because they'd given the money on the basis that they were going to get 300 performances a year, and they had already committed. So I had the rather interesting job of persuading John Sainsbury and Vivian Duffield that they still had to leave their pledges in place, even though they were only going to get 2/3 of the money. And that was probably not a story of quite how they did that for public debate, but it involved some rather interesting conversations with two famously rather difficult people. But essentially, the lever was they cared passionately about having the Opera House with their name associated with it reopened, and they were kind of always going to deliver. The government was apprehensive. The government thought that they would be sticky about it. I kind of knew in my heart that they would not be sticky. They would pretend to be, and we'd have to go through the motions, but they would come round, as indeed they did.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you. We've actually got a question that follows on to that one quite nicely. Someone's just asked, could you let us know what you think will happen with sort of theatres with the current situation, considering that they're not getting any of that advanced cash flow or sort of any incoming sort of revenue at the moment?
I'm afraid I haven't given the matter much thought, but I think it's grim, frankly. I think we're probably not going to have theatres open in the UK. My guess is probably until the spring of next year. I think there's going to be a very long closed period. Now, the artistic enthusiasm is being converted into various other sort of forms and so on, but it's quite interesting. We're seeing particularly comedy shows, for instance, being done without a live audience. And it is now obvious, even to people like me, that you can't do comedy without a live audience because it gets no momentum. It just sort of flat, even if the jokes are intrinsically quite funny. So there will undoubtedly be a cold period. The physical buildings will stay there. The people behind them may shuffle around a little bit. Some people who are over indebted will have a problem. My guess is that some of the marginal institutions will shut, and there'll be a gradual reopening in about a year or so's time. I think it's fair to say that actually the arts do thrive on adversity. Now it's a horrible generalization and it's tough for the people involved, but I think there's quite a lot of evidence historically that actually when the going is tough, that brings out some of the most valued and the most important longer term artistic creations. So, on a tough love basis, I'm probably not too worried, but it's going to be a grim time for people, and undoubtedly quite a lot of people who in happier times would have made a career in the performing arts will, I'm afraid, end up doing something else.
Thank you. Next for a question, we have Zunain Hussain. Let me just unmute. Zunain, are you there?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Perfect. So what I asked was, sometimes after a public sector organization fails, I can think of specific examples I've seen that the people stop trusting them. They stop trusting the public sector, and that there becomes like this idea that the private sector is better, maybe because at some point one of those organizations was led by a corrupt official. But even after a turnaround, no one seems to go back to them, even after the government or any ministry tries to fix the errors they made before. How can they regain the trust of their population?
I'm speaking from a UK context, and it is not necessarily true that this applies everywhere, but broadly public organisations are held in pretty good regard by the general public here most of the time. there's quite a lot of noise around the behavior of individuals, particularly when they're caught doing something hypocritical or whatever. But the idea that public organizations fulfill an important role, and most of the time they're run by and for the benefit of people who are meaning and so on, is pretty deeply established. So I don't think we get that degree of resigned cynicism, perhaps, that you're slightly conveying, and you kind of understand is more of a problem in other places. But even in societies that have a greater difficulty with trusting institutions, people do, I think, still trust hospitals. You know, there are certain types of organizations that they trust more than others. And there are types of organizations that are used for flush throughs of corrupt monies and so on. Hospitals mainly aren't one of those. Arts organizations perhaps sometimes can be. So it's difficult and it takes some time. And if an organization fails, even in the UK, it may take a period of years before the reputation and the credibility builds back up. But I think broadly society wills that to happen here. And you know, it's quite difficult to damage it completely. People will worry quite a lot about the reputation, the name, and so on and so forth. But they tend to be damaged rather than irretrievably ruined, I think.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And yeah, we've had a question coming via email. So it's actually a multi-part question. So I'll just run it through it. So private enterprises are judged as a success based on their performance on various indices, the most important being financial return to shareholders.
Yep.
A, do public sector organizations have similar indices for assessing their performance like private enterprises?
Well,
yeah, go ahead, sorry.
Yes is the answer. That in a sense, maximizing profit isn't generally the objective. Living within your budget and not basically having to turn around to people for bailouts is. So you do need a high quality of financial management for public sector organizations in order to deal with that. And certainly when it comes to running hospitals and dealing with public sector budgets, the finance directors are famously capable of landing the financial outturn for the year within a microscopically small proportion of their turnover, because they mustn't either make a profit or a loss, because both of those cause problems. A loss a bit bigger problem than a profit, but you can't make a big profit either because it implies you've not been using public money properly. So the performance criteria will tend to be other things. And in recent years, there's been a desire to try and put numbers around that, to have specific objectives. Once upon a time, you'd have been comfortable just that a hospital was well thought of, people wanted to go there and it had a good reputation and no scandals attached. These days, it will be expected to have various performance indicators around number of patients treated, number of complaints, you know, various things along those sort of lines. And similarly, you know, academics, for instance, will have issues around making sure that their academics publish the requisite number of papers, which sometimes is considered more important than whether the papers are worth the paper they were written on in the first place. So metrics tend to be invented. They will be different by organizations. They may or may not be comparable, but they're not actually down to profit. But any management team running a public organization will inherit and develop a set of metrics that they will be measured against.
Okay, brilliant. And part B, which one of the indices for assessing public sector organizations is the strongest? That is the one that can be compared with the financial performance success factor of private enterprises.
There's no one. It depends on the nature of what's going on. Avoiding going bust, living within your means, it's not something it's either a yes or a no. You know, you've either managed that or you haven't managed that. If you don't manage that, you're in trouble. But in terms of performance, it will generally be around a continuing high reputation and a high delivery of whatever it is you're doing. The Royal Opera House, without any serious doubt, was considered by people who know much more about this sort of thing than I, to be the most successful opera house in the first 10 years of the new century. That was largely due, in my opinion, to a rather strange chap who did the casting, because you have to cast for opera about 5 years before you actually put the performances on. So this chap had the miraculous ability of being able to listen to artists and have a view as to how good they would sound 5 years later. And he got it right consistently. God knows how he did it, but he did. And that's why the artistic standards were as high as they were. And of course, there's lots of other stuff around choice of program and so on. So all of those difficult things to come together towards an intangible, do your peers at the time of reckoning think you're doing a better job than other people? There are various different ways in which that's done, but there's no one way that is just as nice and simple. Oh, that it were. There's no one way that's nice and simple as saying, you know, are you making a lot of money?
Brilliant, thank you. And yeah, if anyone has any sort of additional questions, please do feel free to send them through to us. We've actually received in a couple, sorry. Let me just unmute Victor Hernandez. 1 second. Hi, Victor, are you there?
Hello, can you guys hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Yes, Victor.
Hello, Pelham, and congratulations. It was very good talk. My name is Victor Hernandez, and my question is related to the human capital, to the human resources within the public sector. I'm also a leading member of a union here in Spain, of a union of teachers, and we're having this debate within our organization, whether going for flexibility or not. Like 20, 30 years ago, there was this new scheme for the welfare state for public organizations to go to this flexi security. It was called like kind of the Dutch model, where the human resources could shape, or they were open to some changes, you know, changes in the hours, shift, different things. To the contrary, that we could have security, there was more certainty. It was this kind of famous pact that agreement that worked for sure, maybe in Holland, I don't know, maybe in the UK, but here in Spain it didn't work that much because it was very much too much flexibility and too little security. And actually the sectors and the public companies that have survived and that are performing well are the ones who have really implemented from the union side and also from the management side this flexi security, which again would be that the labor force would be open to, you know, maybe changing a shift. So someone, instead of working from 9 to 5, being open to work from 5 to 11, something, that tiny thing would avoid additional cost and at the same time will ensure the sustainability of this company, of this thing. So I don't know what's your take on that regarding the human resource unions in the public sector and so on.
It's a complicated question, and I could probably talk for about an hour on it, which is not really fair to anybody else. I think the point that I would make is that almost by definition, the public organizations I'm talking about are frankly professional services companies. They are organizations where individuals are doing a professional job of one sort or another for the benefit of you know, their clients, their customers. I'm pretty convinced, for 50 years of work around this sort of stuff, that you only have a successful professional services business if you treat your people well. If they want to work for your organization, they believe in the organization, and they believe your organization is doing a quality job. So from that point of view, any plan by management or owners, or particularly private equity people, that assumes you can treat your people like a commodity is just, to my mind, doomed to failure. It may not be doomed to failure this month or next, but it is not a long-term sustainable model. Interestingly, at the Opera House, we had a highly unionized workforce, and we talked to the unions before we had our public announcements, And we shared with the unions the same information that we'd shared with the government. And we got a very positive and supportive response. They were desperately keen to maintain the jobs of their members. They were keen to maintain the continuity of the Royal Ballet, of the orchestra, and so on. And they were very cooperative and worked very well with us. That's my closest experience working directly with unions. So treat your people seriously, value them, work with their representatives. Unfortunately, sometimes you will find union representatives who have a different agenda of one sort or another. And we can all probably think of examples of unions that have got the situation pretty much out of control. But in most cases, union representatives and the people they represent are just trying to do a good job for a fair reward, and you have to work with that. That's the sort of the generic answer. We could talk further about it, and if you want to talk specifics, I could do that separately.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think we have time for one last question. So Steve G, I'll just unmute you now.
Yeah, thank you. Really enjoying this and finding it very, very helpful. Working in the charity sector and concerned that there's not enough mid to long-term planning going on in response to the possible economic impact of COVID-19. I really liked your analogy of sitting down with a wet towel and getting to grips with some hard thinking. You mentioned that you're currently advising the Church of England. Are you allowed to mention any pointers that you're highlighting to the COE at present in this regard?
The Church of England is in a wonderful position. Wonderful, actually, in a technical sense. It's a bit like describing their situation as interesting. No, their situation is not wonderful. Not enough people buy the product that they're selling, unfortunately, by quite a substantial margin. But in financial and management terms, they are on a long-term journey of change from a structure that's been around for a long, long time to something that is more appropriate for current society, the way the society is thinking. They've got a short-term financial problem because all the churches are shut. They require a lot on cash donations coming over the plate. That pays their stipends of their priests, and they've got to sort all that sort of stuff out. What I've been arguing to them quite strongly is that clearly they have to do that. It's in nobody's interests, as I was talking earlier, for a short-term financial crisis to lead to people being, put out of work and organizations actually collapsing. But you shouldn't confuse that with thinking about the longer term. The great advantage of a crisis is that actually it forces people to concentrate on the longer term issues. And in the restructuring profession, there's an expression, never waste a good crisis. Now you have to be a bit careful about putting that on the front page of the Daily Mail, but the principle that actually it is only when you focus people's attention firmly that you get to good answers. I mean, a good example in the health service just recently, 3 months ago, 90% of interactions between patients and general practitioners was done face-to-face. Now, 10% of interactions are done face-to-face, and that's been achieved in 6 weeks. Now, people have been trying to do that for years, but it's never been possible. It's now possible, and people are finding, surprise, surprise, this actually works remarkably well. Now, it won't stay down at 10%, it'll go back up, but it'll go back up to 15 or 20, it won't go to 90. So from that point of view, it's really, really important to distinguish between the short-term fixes that make sure you stay afloat and that give you the time to think things through, but then you've got to think through the fundamental questions, and you've got to do so relatively quickly, not in a panic way. So I've been telling the Church of England that we've got to have some sensible plans for what churches are going to look like when all of this comes out, and we've got the summer to do it, but we haven't got 3 years to do it.
Right.
But they don't have to do it by Monday.
Sure. Thank you. That's very helpful.
Brilliant. Thank you.
You're mute, Steve, Keith. Keith?
Okay, but yeah. So yeah, first of all, I just want to say thank you to everyone for joining us. I also want to say thank you, Pelham. Thank you for taking the time. Pelham supports the college massively by giving us time for this, as well as he's been the lead on our Seafront Task Force, which looks towards the redevelopment and sort of the revitalization of the seafront at the college. So really appreciative of all the work and support he does for us here at AC. And yeah, just wanted to say, we'll be sharing with everyone sort of a feedback form. If you have any sort of follow-up questions, do let us know. We can share them with Pelham and see if he's able to get back to us. Information about upcoming talks will be shared on both the website, our social media, as well as our Atlantic Connect website. The next event is on the 21st of May, but we'll be sharing sort of further details on that in the coming days. But yeah, if anyone has any sort of thoughts or feedback, do let us know. We're really excited about this series of events. So far, the feedback has been amazing. So thank you for everyone for joining us. And once again, thank you, Pelham. Really interesting talk. Really appreciate it.
Good. Great pleasure. Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone.